Okay, I'm going to get started running Ardour, and so my favorite way to run something is typing it in like something like this, but you can also open a file browser and go wherever your applications or program files are, and we would find Ardour in there, and we could double click that. So Ardour has started. We're ready to start a new session. Let's leave it as an empty template. But we want to focus down here and make sure we give our session a good name, and we make sure we store it in a folder where we can find it. So I'm going to give it something that's long enough for me to understand what it is, but not so long that I can't read the file name. And I'll just put it on the desktop. We'll click Open to create this session. And then it will come up to check your audio input and output settings. You generally want to leave these alone, but it is worth checking to make sure your input and output devices are set to built-in input and outputs. If they're set to something like none or something you don't recognize, that could be problematic. So we'll leave these and we'll click Start to start audio processing. Okay, and here we have our basic session editor window. In order to show you around, I'm going to skip ahead a bit and just drag in a sound file. After you've made some sounds of your own, you'll have sound files. The easiest way to bring them in is just to drag them into this empty space. So this is the track area, and we see as soon as we brought in my bell sound here, we can see that it created a track and it named it after the sound file. If I want to change the name, I can double click on it and give it a new name. And as we make more tracks, we can go to the track menu up here, say add a track. It'll ask you what kind of track. We just want audio tracks, and it'll ask us how many. And it's nice to have a good handful of tracks just really for spatial organization at first. And so now I've got several tracks here. So right above our track area, we see some ways of measuring time and some other indications here. And I'm going to recommend we get rid of some of these. So I'm going to right click in this blank area, and let's look at time in terms of minutes and seconds, but not in terms of time code. Time code is very similar, but instead of milliseconds, it adds video frames. So this minutes and seconds setting will also give us milliseconds, and that'll be more useful for us. We're also not going to be thinking in terms of bars and beats most of the time, so we'll turn that off, and meter and tempo are ideas that go along with that. The rest of these I'm going to leave in here. You can turn them off later if you want to save even more space, but you might find them helpful for organizing. Immediately above that, we have our toolbar, and we see that our grab tool is selected. And so I'm going to turn off smart mode for a second, and I'll explain that in a bit. But with our grab tool, we can pick it up and move it around in time. We can also move it to a different track, and tracks are really just for organization. And we can see time goes from left to right. We also have range mode. By that, it means selecting a time range. So now when I click on it, or when I click anywhere, it allows me to highlight a time range that I might want to do an operation on. There's also a cutting tool that allows me to cut it, and then I can use my grab tool to separate them if I want to. I'm going to undo that, Command Z, or on Windows, Control Z. And then we'll also look at this stretch mode tool in a bit. Above this area, we've got our clock. And if you don't see a decimal point and 3 digits after the decimal point, you might still be in timecode mode up here. So right click this and set this so that it's in minutes and seconds as well. And then over here, we have familiar play, stop, and record buttons. In general, just in case you can't find these controls, we refer to them as the transport controls. And also there's a whole menu talking about the transport controls and some fancier features with that. The reason for this word goes back to reel-to-reel tape recorders, when the play or stop button would start or stop a motor that would spin the reel that has a tape wrapped around it, and that would in turn move the tape over the play head or the record head. And so it's that notion of moving through time or making time move that connects with this rather outdated term, transport. So if we want to play our sound, well, we can say where to start playing from and push play. We can stop when we want. And we can start playing again or stop. Also, notice up on the transport menu, we'll see that pushing the space bar allows us to toggle starting and stopping. And that's very common for many programs. Then moving on this left side here, we see a baby version of our window that's called the mixer. Here's the full mixer, and so instead of having time spread out horizontally and our tracks represented vertically, time isn't here. This is all for us to think about signal flow, and we'll get into that later. But here, there's one vertical mixer channel corresponding to each track that we have here. And so what we have on the left side of our editing window is a miniature mixer. It's one mixer channel that corresponds to the actively selected track. So this allows us to access things without having to switch back and forth. If you notice, it's Control M to switch back and forth on a Mac anyway, if I want to toggle between the full mixer and the editor mode. But most of the time, we'll just be able to select the track we mean to change and then do some mixer business over here. Down here at the bottom, what we have is a zoomed out view of our whole session window. And so if we want to zoom in and out, we can look under the view menu, and here's some zoom settings. Zooming in and out just in an ordinary way are our minus and equals keys, or if you don't think about it, minus and plus. It's centered on wherever the red position bar is. And you see if we zoom in far enough, we can see the near sine-like waveform. Okay, and we can go out and see taller moments in the waveform or represent louder sounds. Also, now look down here at this light gray area as I zoom in and out. And you see the more I zoom in, the narrower this area gets. The more I zoom out, the wider this area gets. I can also just click and drag on this area and scroll through my whole session if I want to. So if I want to see something closer up and then adjust what I'm looking at, it's easy to drag around. If I'm in this mode where my cursor looks like a four-way arrow, I can click and drag left and right to change this position, but then I can also drag up and down to change my zoom. If I don't want to do that, then I can hover over the left or the right edge and adjust my view this way. But notice how my cursor changed depending on where I am over the object. That's what we call a smart tool. And that's what smart mode meant up here. Smart mode allows me to switch between the grab mode, where if I'm below the 0 line in my waveform, so I click it and it'll move it back and forth. If I'm above the 0 line, it turns into range selection mode. We also have some other smart tool features here. If I'm on the left end of a region, we call every box of sound a region. This allows me to trim the beginning without moving the rest. And you'll also notice these little boxes in the corners. These let me create fades in and out. And so next, let me show you a little bit more about the transport. It's common to want to loop a small selection of time so that it can keep playing it over and over again while we tweak our audio settings. And so we have a couple ways to do that. If I want to do the whole region, then I can right-click the region and say play, and just say to loop this region. And so it's done a couple things here. But we see that it's looping. As soon as it gets to the end, it starts over at the beginning. But notice that it added something to our loop/punch ranges here. And so we've got two little markers here that say loop. They're showing us what the beginning and the end of the area that's going to be looped is. So I can adjust these any way I want. So I can now loop a smaller area. And if I want to play the area that's between these loops, previously I just said, hey, loop this whole thing, and it made loop regions for me. Now that I have some loop regions set, if I want to play the loop region, I need to not use the play button, but play a loop, which can also be triggered with a shortcut L. So even if my position cursor is way out here, I push L, and it jumps to playing this region here. And the whole green area shows what region it's going to play. And so I can tweak those on the fly if I want to. So what about these other markers up here while we're up here? Well, CD markers are, the feature of compact discs that you could label things sometimes. So that's also an outdated term. But for us, it means that you can right-click on the CD markers row here and add a new marker, and then double-click on it and label it. This might be useful for labeling individual moments in your composition. So you can have any number of these. Ardour doesn't care what they say or where they are. They're just for you. And if you don't want to use them, then don't use them. Similarly, we have range markers up here. And so if I right click in here and say, let's create a new range, well, it made 2 markers for me. This allows me to set off something that has a beginning and an end. So notice I gave it a new name, and they're both named this way. So this is showing the beginning of the intro, for example, and this is the ending of the intro. And so once again, those are just for your organizational desires, whatever suits you best. Finally, I want to talk a bit about the anatomy of this session file here, because when we click save, and don't forget to save often, we're not actually saving an audio file, something that we would deliver to someone who is going to be playing our music. What we're saving is this whole session. And so if we open a file browser with my intro session here, we see my intro session isn't just a file, it's a whole folder full of files. And well, we haven't really done much. We just dragged one file in here, but it's actually populated it with all of this stuff. Every time we bring a sound in, like bell, it's going to not just leave it in the place where you got it from, it's going to make its own copy and put it into this session folder. Also, most of the times when we make a change to a file, it's not actually going to change that file, it's making a new copy of it and changing that. And so this is part of what we call non-destructive editing, or at least it allows us an undo feature. But also, every time we load in an audio file, it makes a little picture of what that audio file looks like if we were to graph it. And so there are a lot of supporting files that are going in here too. And so you're going to be able to ignore most of these, although if you wanted to access a version of a file that you've been working with, here it is under interchange and your session name and audio files. But I want you to know that they're there. And so your actual session file is right here. It has your name and then the Ardour extension here. It might look a little different in Windows, but it's going to be something like this. And then you'll want to be able to find your export folder. That's the default place where it's going to put it when we export sound. So keep in mind that one side effect of all this is that the more you work in here, the more the size of your session is going to grow. We can discuss some ways later to clean house a little bit if some materials turn out not to be needed as you go along. But let's go ahead and actually export our session as an audio file. Okay, so we've got basically an infinite amount of time here, and the program's not sure exactly what time range we want to export. So I'm going to recommend doing it in a particular way that should make things easier later. So I'm going to select all the tracks that I mean to export, and then I'm going to select all, or Command A. That's going to not select every track, but instead select every sound region on that track. And then, let's see, I always forget where it is, and this help feature is nice. I want to set the session start and end points based on the range of regions that are selected. And so now we see our location markers row here has been populated with a start and an end. So next time, if I only want to export a little bit of time, I can move these around, or I can use a select tool and use that set start and end from that selection. We can see they've moved. In this case, I'll just go back to where we were before. And so I'll click the top one, I'll hold down Shift and click the bottom one. Make sure they're all highlighted. Command A to select all. And then from the transport menu, set the session start and end from all the regions that are selected. Now I can go not to save as, that's going to save the session. That's like saving your recipe and your ingredients, but not the finished dish. You need to actually put it all together, and so what the export function does is apply that recipe and your ingredients and actually create the audio file that you've been setting it up to create. So we'll click export. And now here, once again, you could leave all of this at the default. It's good to make sure that you've got an uncompressed file format like WAV selected in here, not something like MP3 that's going to be compressed. It's not going to be full quality. It's like the Cliff Notes version. It throws out what details it thinks you would miss. So something like wave format should be fine. Also, it's nice that it's got this feature in here to automatically normalize the loudness. We'll talk about later what that means. But it makes sure that you're using the whole dynamic range and people don't have to turn your music way up in relation to other people's. So look for normalizing loudness and wave. And that was what was selected originally. And just like when we created our session, you want to look for a way to give your exported file a name you're going to recognize and to put it in a folder where you know you'll be able to find it. And so by default, it puts it into your session in the subfolder named export. And so I'll leave that for now, but it's nothing wrong if you want to actually export just to your desktop or something like that. Give it a name section down here is a little bit more complicated. And this is to allow you to stay more organized. You can turn off all this stuff if you want. All I need to focus on is the label section here. This is where I give it a unique name. We might want to have it put in front of it the name of the session. And it does that nicely. We can give it a revision number if we want to. Some representation of the time span. We can do that. If you want to date and time, I like to do it this way, year, month, date all together, and then you can tack on the time too. The nice thing about this is that when you sort alphabetically, they'll also be sorted chronologically. And so next time I go to export it, well, the time is going to be updated automatically, so I don't really need to deal with revisions. All I have to do is click export next time. Next time I'm exporting the same kind of a thing. Otherwise, I just had to focus on this label. And this option down here at the bottom, Analyze Exported Audio, might be on for you by default. You can go ahead and turn it off and it'll stay off. It might be interesting to you to see every once in a while though. What it does is after it finishes exporting a file, it will give you some unique views and statistics about the sound file that you just exported. Anyhow, click Export. And so now in my export folder here, I can see that here's the file that I created. All right, and that's how we get our session set up.